Hi there. Merry Christmas. My name is Rachel Gerber. I'm the denominational minister for youth and young adults for Mennonite Church USA and also the editor of The Gathering Place, which is an interactive website for Anabaptist youth leaders to learn, be, and connect. And you can join the Gathering Place community at www.thegatheringplace.us. Before we begin, I want to apologize for my voice. I sound like I am a little bit of a croaking frog, as 'tis the season, and I have a cold, so please bear with me. And I will not promise to talk too much today because I'm so grateful here in this podcast this month to have Marlene Bogard with us, who is the executive director for Mennonite Women. And Marlene today has had lots of formation experience, and she is going to talk with us about the spiritual formation process of creativity and what does creativity, doodling, coloring, engaging in the artistic process have anything to do with our faith and faith formational practices. So we're so excited to have Marlene here today. And just as a side note, the Gathering Place, we focus on a different theme every month, and everything that we do, talk about, blog posts that we have all center around this theme. And so this month it is Advent, and we are so grateful to have these sacred pauses in the midst of this crazy busy season in which to slow down and to reflect on how can we engage in the true reason for the season. So I'm so grateful for you, Marlene, to lead us in this formational practice today. So welcome, and I'd also just want to say welcome to the others that are joining us today as well. Come on in. Feel free to mute yourself so we can stay focused on Marlene, as with the Google Hangout process. If there's background noise, it'll switch to pick up the noise. So just feel free to join this conversation, but put your mute on. And if you have any questions, do the group chat feature on the side, and I can go ahead and field those questions to Marlene. So welcome, Marlene, and you want to just jump in and take it away?
Sure. Yeah,
Great.
well, thanks. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here on this Advent before our Merry Christmas. Glad for this invitation. I'm glad to visit with you about what is very trendy these days, but also something that I think emerges from our deep inner longing to connect with God in many different ways. So I'm going to kind of pop around a little bit reading a bunch of different things. I put a blog out this last week, and I'm going to talk a little bit about creativity, then I'll talk about some prayer, how prayer practices can be infused with creativity, how that might draw us closer to God, how praying in particular ways might feel more authentic to us if we experiment a little bit. So if you've noticed, in bookstores or blogs or posts or shopping, adult coloring books are all the rage. And there's just, especially if you go into arts and craft stores, they're everywhere. Some are very expensive, some are very cheap. It's meant to be, I think, a relaxing and enjoyable kind of a thing, and maybe reminiscent for those of us as adults who might think, oh, I remember coloring. And it can be, you can do it together as a family or individually or as a group. And my question is, have you ever considered how coloring might be a kind of spiritual practice? Doodling as a way to pray. So I've long been on a mission to help folks claim their own spirituality style. And by that I mean that each of us gravitate towards connecting with God in different ways. Some of us find worship meaningful when we sing together in four-part harmony. Others might run away from that and say, oh no, praise and worship songs are where it's at. Some of us love to be in nature as our primary spiritual practice, with ferns and trees or in a big prairie or on a woodsy path. And others of us might say, oh no, I would rather spend hours in meditation and prayer in a monastery or in a quiet, dark corner. So some of us might read and ponder, and others of us might thrive in the midst of color and design. And all of these are what I would consider spirituality styles, or their preferences on how we might want to relate to God in the way that feels most natural to us, most authentic, the way that helps us feel most alive. And all of these ways reflect our own personal creativity DNA. So what we're going to be talking today is somewhat about creativity, but for those of you who think that creativity just isn't part of your DNA, well, we've got news for you. So as I like to say, creativity comes natural to us because as Christians, we believe that God is our creator. We are therefore made in God's image, and therefore we are like mini creators. It comes naturally to us because we are created in God's image, who is a creator. We are created to create. And since I work for Men at Women USA, I probably should, and maybe Rachel can put this up in the resources. Spark is a women's Bible study created by Mennonite Church Canada and Mennonite Church USA. We partnered together on that. And it's written by April Yamasaki, a pastor in British Columbia. She explores biblical texts to embrace our gift of creativity. And it's a 13-session guide available from our website or from Menno Media. It's called Spark, Igniting Your Given Creativity. So since I have a long history of offering resources, I'll pop a few of those in now and then. So that might be something you might want to look into too, as well as trying to find your creativity. But I'm going to start off a little bit with some questions for you to ponder regarding prayer. I've asked these questions in a number of settings, and be curious to know if you would agree with me, or in particular, which ones do you feel most comfortable with in terms of these definitions? So when I say, what is prayer? Prayer is a communication with a God who loves us. What is prayer? Prayer is discovery of our rightful place, a place of communing with God, which creates a wonderful sense of homecoming and belonging. What is prayer? It can be an enormous sense of relief that we can bring our concerns to God. What is prayer? Prayer is the privilege of being involved in God's story of redemption. What is prayer? Prayer is a paradox. It's both a place of safety where we are accepted and loved, and it's a place of risk where God pushes us out of our comfort zone. Two more. What is prayer? It's a lonely and desolate place where God hears the deepest longings of our hearts. And finally, what is prayer? It could be a creative adventure with no formulas and no guarantees of success. And these were adapted from one of the books I listed on the chat feature there, Transforming Prayers by Jenny Baker, which is one of my all-time favorite prayer resources for the reasons that you just heard. She comes with a deep sense of spirituality and spiritual formation, but she also infuses a lot of ideas with great respect for different spirituality styles. And I'm also now going to reference another book called Savoring God, Praying with All Our Senses, by Kathy Finley, and that's also in the chat box. I like the way she talks about our senses. And all of this stuff that we're talking about now is kind of a precursor to what I call praying in color. So this is kind of like the foundational work. Kathy says, fasten your seatbelt. This book is an invitation to a different way of praying and a different way of seeing. Usually when we pray, we shut out the outside world and focus on the interior realm that we often think of as beyond us or above us, kind of the transcendent. Instead, this book invites you to be with God through the tangible, specific objects of your everyday life. Does that sound familiar? Sounds like Jesus. To take another look, as well as another listen, taste, touch, and smell, it is right before you to see God there. God has given us our five senses as important ways to understand and appreciate the world. The Hebrew and Christian scriptures believe that Jesus is God, God with us, Emmanuel, some of my favorite words during the Advent and Christmas season. Christians believe that Jesus is God incarnate, or as a wonderful young theologian to be says, God's show and tell. I love that phrase. Jesus is God's show and tell. In Jesus, all of human life and creation has been a sign of God's presence, filled with sacraments with a small s, and ways to grow closer to God if we just look again. Jesus was aware of this in senses and indeed spent much of his ministry healing the senses of those who came into his ministry. So I love thinking about senses that way. However, and we're continuing to realize today that people see and hear and experience our world in 1,000 different ways. We've learned a lot about personality styles through Myers-Briggs or other kinds of personality inventories, through the Enneagram, how we learn, how we experience life, how we experience God. And I also believe this is reflected in This Is How We Pray. So that would be another book I would heartily recommend to you, Savoring God. So now I'd like to go ahead and talk a little bit about this book, which you can see has got bunches of Post-it notes on it, Praying in Color. And maybe why don't you just put in the chat box if you have seen this book or worked through this book, or if this concept is brand new to you. Sybil Macbeth is the author of this book. It started out with one simple book called Praying in Color. Then there was a workshop. Then there was Praying in Color with Children. Then there's a book called Praying in Black and White. That's for men. So not sure I've spent a lot of time with that. But it's become quite an enterprise and quite an accessible resource. So this is what we're going to spend a little bit more time with today. This is from the back of the book. Maybe you love color. Maybe you hunger to know God better. Maybe you are a visual or kinesthetic learner, or a distractible or impatient soul. I could nod yes to all of those. Maybe you're a word-weary prayer. And for those of us who don't prefer not to use words in prayer, this might feel especially refreshing. Maybe you struggle with a short attention span, a restless body, or a tendency to live in your head. This new style of prayer can take as much time or as little time as you want. So Praying in Color.
And by the way, what's your favorite color, Marlene?
Oh, I love that question. Well, I'm going to go with green today.
Great.
I'll go with green. Advent green, forest green. Yeah. So I think that might change based on the seasons, but I do love green. It's a strong nature color. Yeah. Okay, and Elsie says on there that she has seen it and read parts of it. And she also says that she started her coloring in green today. Very interesting. Okay. So I'm going to just read some excerpts from this and then just go ahead and talk a little bit about some personal experiences I've had with this. Sybil says, does a carnival of pens and colored markers really count as prayer? Or is it just a sanctimonious way of play to say that I've prayed when really I've just doodled and colored and played? And I think that that's an honest question, and we could explore that a little bit. I guess for me it would depend on what your what you're coming to that practice with. So I use the phrase praying in color as one of many possible spiritual practices. And if you're comfortable with that language or familiar with it, it just means that it's just one way to kind of be in God's presence. It's one way to express your love or your deepest yearnings to God. That's what I consider a spiritual practice, as opposed to a spiritual discipline, which may seem or feel a little bit more rigorous.
I think that's a good, I was just going to say, I think that that's a good way to separate what a spiritual practice is from a discipline. I mean, because I think that prayer is all of life, right? You know, and so how I love that of praying in color, as that it is just a seamless part of who we are and how our life is a lived prayer. So beautiful.
Yeah. Sybil talks about one of her first early experiences with praying in color, and she actually used it with a group of teenagers. And I have done that as well. I have done praying in color with teenagers, with children, with young adults, and with what I would consider older adults, and everybody in between. I've done a bunch of different learning times with them, and all different experiences. You can almost immediately tell when people are uneasy with the practice, and of course you can explore that more deeply. Is just why are you uncomfortable with coloring, or is it because you're trying to set yourself free from some other rigors that are holding you back? But to me, it's a very freeing thing.
Could you tell us a little bit about how you actually pray in color?
Sure. Yeah. Yep. That's coming up here.
Okay.
I've got the steps lined out. So in praying in color, if you want to go with what Sybil recommends, here's a couple of different ways to start. She might say you start in an empty page with just one symbol in the middle. So that symbol could be like a squiggle. It could be I'm going to try to find one here. It could be a square. It could be a heart. It could be anything. But it would be just simply something like this. I put it up.
Yeah.
There. So she put Robert in the middle of this page in a square. So you can see this is not anything fancy. It's very much from the heart. So she evidently wanted to pray for Robert this day and put a simple shape in the middle. And then she just invites you to bring Robert into the presence of God. And as you offer colors, as you offer doodles, as you offer designs, these are all offered along with your thoughts as prayers. It's just that simple. And so it's just basically spending time with a person in mind and bringing them to the presence of God. And the coloring or the doodling process is one that, in one way, it kind of keeps your hands busy. But in another way, you can notice things like, well, what shapes are you using? What colors are you using? Here's another one with Cynthia. Now, Cynthia doesn't have a lot of doodles around her, but there's other people in her space. Okay? When I do a praying in color workshop, I actually try not to show them the designs first, because I want to be very clear that it's not a model that has to be followed. It has to be a much more organic process. Another way of doing it is, so that was kind of more of a prayer on behalf of someone, the Robert prayer. Another prayer might be something like, she says it for remembering. So this page is called Remembering. So she is doing a lot of maybe writing full phrases and just adding a lot of color and doodling around that. Remembering important concepts, remembering ideas, remembering something you maybe heard in a presentation, keynote speeches, poems. It's just kind of another way to let information soak in. So that can be a kind of prayer. This one on discernment, I know, has been very helpful for me and for others, and that is maybe you're considering a large life change, a move, a job change, whether to have children, I mean, all those kinds of things, and just to lay them out on paper and kind of play with them. Add phrases around them, add some scripture bits. One of the questions that people often want to know is, how do I know when I'm done? Well, you don't ever have to be done with your prayers. You can leave them and come back to them. Here's a question. Here's one that she's actually kind of praying her calendar. So you'll notice that there are blank spaces, but there are spaces that are filled in. Maybe she spent time with these people. Maybe there's a place that she's praying for. You'll see Cuba on there, Sudan, Iran, Lebanon, and just so holding them in prayer as you spend time in color. What does that sound like to you? Anybody have any comments on that?
Yeah, feel free to write those in your chat box feature about what does praying in color, how does that strike you? Mm-hmm. And if you have a piece of paper and a pen or a marker or a colored pencil while Marlene's talking, feel free to doodle away, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll show you a little bit of a progression of how she does the name one. And it's just super simple. So, oh, there's Marlene and Rachel. Oh, show that up again, Elsie. Aw. Does everyone see that? Oh, we have yellow, and we have, yeah, very nice. Okay, so don't let me forget. I want to talk about how I work with people in this process. But while we're doing a little sharing, let me just show. So that's one. You know, she just starts out with Sue. Write the person in the shape. We talked about that, and then here's just some ideas about how she adds on to Sue. Another way that and then here's Sue and Mary. So, oh, well, let's not forget Mary. Mary is Sue's sister or whatever, and we need to, and then she brings in more and more people.
I would think that, you know, like any sort of a prayer experience or spiritual practice, that it's going to feel awkward at first. You know?
It might. Mm-hmm.
And
yep.
And that's okay. Exactly like maybe resourcing via the internet, like what we're doing right now.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
One of the ways that I have really, now this isn't necessarily with the creative process, but have enjoyed doing daily devotions is through an online site called Sacred Space.
Yes.
And it's a meditative space from the Irish Jesuit priests, and it's just a beautiful way. But you know, I'll say that it took a little bit. I'm praying with my computer. That feels really weird,
right.
You know. And so I think, you know, allowing yourself to also have that grace as you engage in this process to sort of just be gracious and letting yourself be and enjoy it. I mean, I think sometimes we think that praying has to be work and it has to be, you know, this serious thing. And are we actually praying? If we're having fun and just sort of what feels like playing and messing around. But I think in time it'll be really fruitful. So
yeah, and one of my friends who does a lot of art, she said when she does praying in color, it feels to her like, she calls it doodling in the face of God. Not doodling or doodling before the face of God. I don't know. It's just like she's taking her doodling and she's expressing herself expressing it as a prayer. So anyway, there's a lot of ways to do that. Yeah, and I also like, I mean, we're focusing on coloring and doodling here, but obviously, you know, depending on kind of your spirituality style, I would say I often feel closest to God when I am out walking in nature, and that is a big prayer time for me as well. I was going to say a little bit more about some possibilities for working in the praying in color kind of mode would be, so we started out with kind of a free form shape. Another way to do it, and I've done this with all ages again, is just to trace your hand. And I mean, if people are kind of stuck, if they feel uncomfortable or awkward, like you say, and there are some who don't even, just the idea of doing something free form feels scary, then just give them a shape. instruct them in a shape, give them a hand, or maybe even seasonally now, give them a star, or I mean, if it's hard for them to draw a freeform star or they're bent on perfection, let them trace a star. And then, encourage them to think of 5 or, 6 points on a star or whatever areas of their life that they would like to offer in prayer, or 5 people, or 5 places, situations, and then they can go ahead and write them and then work from there. So sometimes it really does help to give a framework, especially for those who feel like it's a little awkward. Like for Christmas and Advent, oh my goodness, there'd be all kinds of possibilities for shapes, meaningful shapes, candles, all kinds of things. You could even start with something that's on your church bulletin. I do want to say just a couple of things about the process of praying in color. If you personally love this and gravitate to it, then just do it. If you're interested in doing it as kind of a resourcing thing with groups of people, there's a couple of kind of cautions that I would say, or a couple of things that I have built into my presentations. The first thing is to kind of give kind of a pastoral word to them, and offer them some scriptures about how it's great to delight in ourselves and in God. And the Praying in Color book has quite a few of those. There's a lot in the Psalms. There's a lot in Isaiah about delighting in the Lord and God's delight in you. So that I kind of build it out of that perspective. Another thing is that almost immediately, depending on the group you're in, some people will say, but I'm not creative, or I'm not an artist. And so then we kind of have to go back and do a little foundational work, or maybe offer some comments out. What we're going to do here in Praying in Color is actually not about art. It's about spirituality. And it's not about the product, it's about the process. So with that in mind, I tell my groups that they will not need to share their prayer. And lots of times, like the real strong extroverts are just like, oh no, I want to share my prayer. I said, well, that's up to you if we've got time at the end. But I wanted also to free them to do whatever they want and know that we're not going to critique it or evaluate it. It's kind of like their offering to God, and it represents their time with God. So I think that that's an encouragement, kind of a little empowerment to people who know that, okay, this isn't supposed to be like art class, and it isn't supposed to be like something amazing that I create that I have to show. And I'm very careful, very careful at the end of the time when I look at the prayers that I don't comment in an evaluative way on anybody's. So if anyone wants to tell us about their prayer, they can, but I never ask them to tell us about your art or tell us about, that kind of a thing. So.
Or even to ask like a question would be like, what surprised you as you look at this picture?
Yeah.
Right. What emerged that maybe was deep within your soul that you didn't even realize was there, that emerged here on this paper, and
right.
Reflect on it from a spiritual direction point of view.
Absolutely. Yeah, you could certainly do that. And to ask a lot of questions that are not meant to be answered out loud. They would be pondering or reflection questions, or, like, think about why you chose the colors you did. When with this particular person, or with this particular, or are your, do your shapes represent something? Are they hard edges or are they soft edges? People, you can pull out a lot of that kind of a thing, right? And another question I ask is, do you want to do this again? Or what have you learned about kind of your own comfort zone in doing play with God? Is it a source of comfort? Do you want more of it? Or would you just as soon put the markers down and say, I don't want to do this, I want to go sing a hymn? Or do I want to pray with words? So it's a really can be really kind of a cool introduction to spirituality and faith formation too, because it kind of appeals to our most basic abilities to just pick up a colored instrument and have color. So, yeah. Any other thoughts on that?
Does anybody have any other comments about praying in color before we maybe move on to some other ways of engaging?
Yeah.
We're ready to move on? Looks like we are. Okay.
Yeah. I was just going to offer one more little quote from the Praying in Color book, because I love the way she connects this experience to what is childlike faith. And lots of us as adults who think we've arrived, or we might have a particular degree, or we think we have a kind of sophistication about our faith, I think sometimes we are the most resistant to doing things that are very kind of organic and freeing. And so she just offers some great encouragement, in particular about creative prayer, and maybe this is a good kind of segue to some other conversations. Sybil says, most of my life I have prayed with the top 7 inches of my body. You get that? The top 7 inches of my body. And I would also say, what is it that we experience in many of our worship services? Some of us have gone to some very cerebral worship services and either find great connection there or little connection. And all of that causes me to reflect and ask the question, well, what is your spirituality style? What are you hungry for? And what do you need more of? So Sybil says, in regards to the top 7 inches, prayer consisted of corralling respectable and respectful thoughts into comprehensible words and sentences. Most of it was done sitting in silence with closed eyes. And oftentimes this is what our traditional prayer life is like. We sit, we're quiet, we fold our hands, we close our eyes. But then she says, my body has rebelled against these parameters. Yeah, my body, it likes to move. Most bodies like to move, but the body does not want to be rejected as a less spiritual part of our being. So traditional methods of entering into prayer and seeking stillness are difficult for her and other movers. If I try to sit in a chair, fold my hands and breathe deeply, my body rebels. My body gets in the way. The whole package of our being deserves and desires to enter into prayer. So for those of us who love contemplative spirituality, there's plenty out there in terms of how to do those practices. For those of us who love to move or like less contemplative ways, I think we are always looking for affirmation that, oh, what you're doing truly is prayer as well. So that we don't, I think my encouragement to all of us is that we don't look at one particular style of spirituality and say, this ranks above all else. This is the highest good. So that's why I'm encouraging us to respect each other's ways that we like to connect with God.
Well, I think for so long we've disengaged our body from our spirit, I mean,
right.
And it's like, and that I think that's what I love about this type of practice is that it's connecting the two again in intentional ways, to say the body is also good. The body is good, and it is a way that we can also connect with our Creator who gave us a body,
Yeah.
I think that's really neat. And like what Elsie said a little bit ago over here in the chat, she said, I pray best when I swim laps, and so that movement of the body to reaffirm and be okay with, as a way of spiritual connection is not only okay but good. Yeah.
Right. And Elsie's a good friend of mine, so I'm going to comment on her comment there. She says, when no one is watching, I pray and dance. So that's an interesting comment that I would do some of that myself too. And the question I would ask myself is, why is it important that no one's watching? I mean, maybe you want it to be a personal private expression, which is to be honored. But it's also it's also maybe because it's not, that kind of expression has not always been warmly received in our faith tradition. And Jennifer Delante, practicing yoga, a marvelous integrative experience. Yes, and I am not a practicer of yoga, but I've heard many, many good things about that, about the integrative, the breathing and the stretching and the strength and the focus. Right. So I'll just tell one other story about how I kind of claimed walking as a spiritual practice. Probably maybe 4 or 5 years ago, we had a big pasture in Kansas, about a 4-acre pasture, and always worried in the winter that it would catch fire because we had often dry winters. So I talked my husband into mowing. We got it mowed, and I said to him, hey, would you mow me a path in there with a riding mower so I could do some walking? So one time I came home from work, and yeah, he'd mowed a path, huge, big path. But here's the deal. It wasn't a straight path. It went around the pasture, and then it zigzagged, and it went around and around, which for him was a really big deal because he's like Mr. Symmetry. So I thought, oh, this is great. This is exactly what I want, because who wants to walk a straight path, right? So I got in that pasture, and I walked all around the edges, and then I did the middle, and so on. And it wasn't a true labyrinth, but it was just kind of a complex, angular thing. And it was one of the best times I've ever had in nature, because I walked it, and every step I took, I offered prayers and I offered thoughts, and all of a sudden I found myself in the middle of the pasture. And it was there that I literally lifted my hands up, which that's not one of my go-to spiritual things, but it was just like my hands were raised, and I just kind of gave myself up to that, at that time, I guess I would say, God's will. And so I was surprised by that, with what the walking did for me when I was particularly tuned in that it was walking as prayer. So, okay, and there's a comment from Elsie saying that they mow a loop around their property as well. That's great. Yeah. So I guess above anything, my encouragement to all of us is just to go ahead and experiment, and to see what feels comforting, and to also pay attention to what feels awkward, and ask yourself, why is that? So Rachel, the only other thing that I'd like to do is go ahead and just hold up one of our giant coloring sheets.
I hope you do. Sure. Yeah.
So what started all of this was that Like Women USA is doing a little campaign on, or we're going to develop a little more campaign on creativity and spirituality. And so I met with my new friend out in Oregon, Trudy McKinney, and this is one of the 6-foot coloring sheets, which, as you see, it fills up my entire table. And what I need now is I need more friends to come over and color with me.
But that's a great idea. I mean, I love it. Tell the folks how you've gathered some people up that sort of have bent to do this, and you're starting to create community around coloring. It's great.
I'm very hungry for community out here in my new area, and so I know a lot of older women, older than me, and I know a few more young adults. I don't know a lot of women my age. So I decided I'd call or email all the young adults I knew, and there were 6 or 7. And when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about 32 or under. And to come over for a night of coloring. And so it quickly became clear to me that they had a lot to say to each other. And I actually just kind of backed away from the conversation. They were all around my dining room table, and they connected with each other in marvelous ways, talking about common threads, kind of, but also very much life stage stuff. And I told them, I said, there's no agenda for tonight. Just come in. I have hot chocolate and snacks, and I've got the coloring sheet. So just come and be. And they did. And so I had to set aside some of my expectations of what I thought might happen and just let it go. And I think they all had a really good time. The interesting thing was they didn't do a whole lot of coloring. They did some really nice, like careful, intensive shading and doodling, but they didn't see it as a thing that had to be finished, which was really cool. It's just like, you don't have to come here and do a task. You just come here and be together. So that was lots of fun. And then out of that, Trudy and I decided to go ahead and market some additional coloring sheets off of our website. And they're becoming pretty popular. We've gotten over 50 orders so far. So
that's wonderful. I think that's just so fun and such a creative way of like you said, engaging community and creating that space for people just to be and be together, and where that might lead in the future, who knows? But it's a great spark of that connection. Yeah. And I love to hear what Jennifer also says is that she got one of these sheets and is going to take it to her board meetings. For the group meetings to color in. I mean, I think something happens when we switch back and forth between the different sides of our brains, that we get to a different place than what we would if we were just strictly talking about an agenda or whatever. I think that's so cool. And just to let everyone know, if you go to the very top of the group chat, I have a link if you would like to directly link into how to purchase those, and I'll also include that when I post this podcast on our website. So yeah. Well, I'm so grateful, Marlene, for you and your role and being able to think outside the box in new and creative ways yourself. I think you are just such a blessing to the Mennonite women here in Mennonite Church USA and wherever you go in your own local community. So thankful for you. Do you have any last minute words, or does anyone else have any final comments or questions?
My encouragement would be take time to play. And good, here's Elsie's holding up her prayer for us today. Thank you, Elsie.
It's beautiful. And I wish Elsie's sound was allowed to, not allowed, but it was not working properly today. So we wish we could hear you and your verbal comments too. So.
If I may comment to Elsie's question in the chat line, have you gotten a Canadian contact to order them from? No, we do not. If you have any suggestions on that, send me an email or a message, and maybe we can work something out. As we know, it is hard to ship back and forth from U.S. and Canada, but maybe we can figure something out.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining in, and gathering here around this conversation. It's always fun to see what emerges, and especially when we can learn and talk about new ways of praying and being together in the creative spirit and divine. So I'm so grateful for you, Marlene, and the role that you do, and the others of you who joined in for the conversation. And continue to check back in with the Gathering Place. Like I said, every month we focus on a different theme, and even though with my role as denominational minister for youth and young adults, there is some of a bent towards youth and young adults, but the way that I approach faith formation is that it needs to come from a whole lifespan, and that there's multiple ways that if the theme interests you, I guarantee that you will be able to connect and take some nuggets out of it. So in January, just a little plug here, we are focusing on Rewilding the Way, which is out of the new book from Todd Windward, talking about how did Christianity get so tame, and how do we write that and get back to following this untamed God. So exciting stuff coming down the pipeline. So anyhow, very grateful for you, and Merry Christmas, everyone, and thanks again for joining. Until next time.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.